welcome you, and it's a great crowd. We appreciate you all coming out. They're both in meetings, unavoidable meetings. It tells me I'm getting ready to drive to a 6-hour drive, so I'm not really in uniform, so to speak. But I'm happy to be able to share this experience with you. Today, our guest lecturer is an undergrad student. Many of you may know him and be in class with him, Miles Vining. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in 2010. He was an infantry rifleman. He was assigned to 1st Battalion, 9th Marine Corps in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. And through his Marine Corps experience, he was an automatic rifleman, armory custodian, taking care of maintenance and storage of weapons, scout sniper observer, a squad leader, a team leader, and a tactical interpreter while deployed 2 deployments in Helmand Province in Afghanistan. After he was discharged from the Marines in 2014, he came here to Indiana University, and he's in Central Eurasian Studies, focusing on Farsi and Pashto languages, and he hopes to graduate in December of 2016. I think he's on track. The only thing I have against him is he's a Marine. That's I can't help that. But I think the topic today is of interest. It will show you what soldiers and leaders on the ground, when they're deployed, enforcing our U.S. foreign policy, trying to do the best job they can, the challenges they face sometimes in different cultures. And that's what he wants to talk about today, is a particular cultural issue, the experience in Afghanistan. I was watching General John Campbell at the Senate Armed Services Committee testimony a few days ago, maybe a couple of weeks now. And he had a lot of questions, but there was one question on this very topic that Miles is going to cover today. And I thought of all the great answers he gave about operational things, he stumbled over that one a little bit because of our policies, and I think Miles is going to cover that. So without further ado, I'll introduce Miles Vining, and please welcome him to the lecture.
Thank you very much, Rick. I appreciate that. Thank you very much for coming out. I know free food doesn't come out very often at all, so I appreciate you all showing up today and listening to me ramble for the next hour. So the topic today is Bacha Bazi, and the topic came up recently. A New York Times article came out a couple weeks ago on September 20th, and a lot of people were riled up about this. Essentially, if you don't know what Bacha Bazi is, it is the sexual attacks on teenage boys in Afghanistan, usually from the ages of 10 to about 21. Usually it's from positions of power. So this would be higher civilians or Afghan commanders, stuff like that. And the problem is, it's a centuries-old tradition, but the problem is that a lot of it is happening on U.S. bases, on U.S. installations. And it seems as if the United States is somewhat bankrolling this in a way, because we fund the people doing it, we fund the Afghans doing it, we fund the bases, we fund the fields, fund the supplies. And I'm going to talk about all that today. And this isn't an excuse or an explanation of why it happened. This is the context in which it took place. I'm not defending the military or going against the military either way. I'm just explaining to you this is how such a horrible act, such a horrible thing was able to take place. So, what this talk will not be about, I won't be able to answer lofty questions, policies, American policy in Afghanistan, Afghan policy towards Americans, anything beyond my level right here. This is the flak jacket that I wore for 2 deployments in Afghanistan. This is what this talk is going to be centered on. My perspective, my experience at the platoon level and below on how Bacha Bazi happened in our PBs, in our COPs, and so forth. This is what this talk is going to be centered on. I cannot go beyond my experience level. So, what is Bacha Bazi? Literally, Bacha means child or children in Farsi and in Pashto. And Bazi Kardan, means to play. So literally playing of boys. The practice is thousands of years old. Alexander the Great had a bacha, a boy bacha as we call it. It's primarily today, it's focused in Afghanistan and in Uzbekistan. This is a picture from Uzbekistan. the two parts of it, mostly it revolves around dancing boys, and you can see pictures of that right there. Parties, social events, weddings, they'll bring a bacha in and then they'll dance for them to imitate a woman. Oftentimes at the end of the night, highest bidder gets to take the boy home. That's how it happens in most of these cases. Can you press the YouTube video? This is a YouTube video, and just to see how rooted this is in Afghan culture and Afghan society, if the video gets to play, this is a video of a Bacha Bazi party. And it came out on YouTube and it was pretty famous because the video includes one of the prior defense ministers of Afghanistan in it. They zoom into the video, the prior defense minister is sitting somewhere over here, just as an example. It's pretty slow. All right, we can stop it. So, anyways, the context of Bacha Bazi is humongous. It's firmly rooted in Afghan culture, in Afghan society. That does, most Afghans consider it immoral. Most Afghans know it's un-Islamic. Most Afghans don't like it at all, but it still exists. This talk won't be about the civilian aspect of Bacha Bazi. That is a whole nother ballgame. This is just how Bacha Bazi took place on the context of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. So, just to set the stage. Helmand province, one of the most volatile regions in Afghanistan. About 70% of the world's heroin comes from the opium production in Helmand. The Marine Corps went into Helmand in about 2010, 2009, because the British weren't having a very good time in securing and bringing peace and stability. Essentially, Obama asked the Marine Corps if they could go in, and the commandant said, yeah, sure, I just have to it has to be a whole Marine operation, from logistics to air to ground troops whatsoever. But basically, the Marine Corps was centered on counterinsurgency operations, COIN, which consists of working with the populace, of trying to bring peace and stability, of trying to fight the Taliban, at the same time trying to build up the population, establishing elections, voting, that sort of thing, interacting with the people. How we went about this is we had various patrol bases, and I'll go into what those are in a second. But this is Nawa district in Helmand. All these are located, patrol base Mama Khan, patrol base Loikale, where I was at, patrol base Galragi, patrol base Jaker, and then Fob Geronimo. This is how we went about the process of bringing peace and stability. Is we established these bases all over the region. And we would run patrols out of these bases, and we would work with the Afghans there in partner patrols. This is an example of a partner patrol with Marines and Afghan uniform police. And just to go along with this concept, we have something called the three-block war. The three-block war theory is a concept of a Marine rifle squad will have to be able to, on one city block, be dealing with kinetic actions, calling in airstrikes, going in firefights. On the second block, rebuilding the damage that they just created. Then on the third block, dealing with humanitarian aid, handing out food, dealing with elections, that sort of thing. But the theory is that a squad will have to do this in a single day. So, installations. This is where the Bacha Bazi practices in context of the U.S. military is happening. Alright, we've got forward operating bases, camps such as Camp Lebanon. A camp will have maybe a division-sized element, maybe 10,000 troops. A forward operating base, maybe 1,000. A patrol base, maybe more like 50 or 20 troops. And then a combat outpost, maybe a squad or 12 guys or so. Most of these are partnered. So at a patrol base, you'll have a Marine rifle platoon along with an ANA or Afghan National Army platoon or an Afghan Uniform Police squadron or whatever right there, and they'll be working together, going on patrols together, supporting each other, mostly with the Marines being in an advising role. Patrol base Loikale was where I was in 2011 for my first deployment. That's Loikale. The Helmand River is just beyond here. This is a smaller river. This is in the center of Nawa. This was the extent of the patrol base. These were all the Marines who were there, about 15 guys at this patrol base, essentially in the middle of nowhere, probably 15 kilometers to the nearest other base. These are the two police commanders that I'll go into about them later. So, Afghan Uniform Police, Afghan National Army. These were the Afghan Uniform Police who were at our patrol base, the two commanders right here, who were practicing Bacha Bazi. And mostly, from my experience, Bacha Bazi has happened among the Afghan Uniform Police. because the AUP, that's the abbreviation for them, the AUP were more localized. They were from the region. All the Afghan police here were from Helmand, whereas the Afghan National Army, they'd have troops from Ghazni or from Kunduz in the north operating in Helmand province, kind of how the US military works, just stationing guys everywhere, whereas the police were much more localized. So it was much easier for the police to continue this practice than the army would, because it's easier for them to know the area and for them to take on children under their care and make them sex slaves, so on and so forth. So the first reason, I'm going to give three explanations, three bits of context for how this took place. And I want to talk about a non-permissive cultural environment as a force protection measure. So what this means is the military had a very hardline attitude towards cultural interaction. What I mean by that is, for example, with women, the official policy, the official rule of engagement was don't look at women, don't touch them, don't search them, don't do anything. They have nothing to do with them, to the point of if a woman is coming towards you on a patrol, just let her go past, don't even search her. Second, rules of engagement regarding mosques. The official rules of engagement were the same thing with women. Don't enter a mosque, don't search a mosque. If you receive fire from a mosque, don't return fire, except in a extreme self-defense situation. If you're walking beside a mosque and the Taliban happen to be in it and they open fire on you and you're in the middle of the street, you have to get out of it. In fact, one of the rules regarding mosques was that if you ever do have to return fire, you have to report it up and you have to ask the general's permission to go all the way up. That's how severe it was. Second, holy month of Ramadan. During Ramadan, the theme was, hey, we can't make them patrol. Don't make the AUP patrol. If they want to stay home because they have to fast all day, let them do that. We'll go on our own patrols and we'll take care of that ourselves. Reason being for these two things, and then conduct towards detainees. Beginning of the war, detainee conduct was pretty bad, such as Abu Ghraib, and we'll talk about that in a second. But same exact thing, hard rules toward detainees. You can only keep them for 96 hours for question, then you have to release them unless you have hard evidence, so on and so forth. The point I'm trying to make with all this is all these were very hardline, non-cultural, cultural non-interaction policies that took place because of some of the examples I'm going to go into a bit. If any one of these was gone against, took action against, if we searched a woman, if we entered a mosque for searching, if we made the AUP go on a patrol, if we took detainees illegally, unwillingly, so on and so forth, the effect of that among the local populace would almost jeopardize the success that we would have had with the local populace, in that rumor would have gotten around and people would have said, hey, Marines are touching our women. In fact, maybe we were just searching them in a completely tactical, legitimized manner, but that doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it comes down to Marines are hurting our women, so on and so forth. Marines are going into our mosque. Marines are making us work doing Ramadan, so on and so forth. In this context is where we bring in Bacha Bazi. Because Bacha Bazi is an extremely cultural practice, so when we come to deal with it at the local level, at the platoon level, we have, okay, what are we going to do with Bacha Bazi? We've got our police commanders sexually abusing boys on our patrol base. Well, it's a cultural thing, and we have to go through with this policy. This is one of the reasons why we kind of lumped Bacha Bazi into that context of saying, well, we don't do anything towards women, we don't do anything towards mosques, even if it's tactically feasible to search women. And you might ask, well, why didn't we have Marine women or Marine females search women? We did. They were called FET teams, female engagement teams, but their success was very little. There were very little teams. I only saw one team doing my entire first deployment, and that was only for about a week. They couldn't be everywhere all the time. So their success was really mute. But anyways, you take Bacha Bazi and you say, okay, what do we do with this? How do we work against this in a positive or a negative light? Well, you don't. You just don't touch it, which goes into mosques, women, Ramadan, etc. As an example, so this goes into something the Marine Corps has called the Strategic Lieutenant and Lance Corporal. The implications of this is that a single Marine or a single fire team or a single squad can do an action on the battlefield that will have strategic implications for the country as a whole. Meaning one guy can make one mistake regarding that cultural topics I just talked about earlier. One guy can have one mistake on that and that will ruin everything nationally. And we'll go into that in a second. As an example, Abu Ghraib. As an example, the 3-2 Snipers Urination video in 2012. This was just a small team of guys, but it almost ruined relations between Afghanistan and the United States. In Basra in Iraq, there was a roadblock and a couple Iraqis were shot. It was for, the patrol said it was for a legitimate reason, fearing for their lives, self-defense. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what it was for, if it was legitimate or illegitimate. It seemed like they shot detainees on purpose in cold blood. And what that turned into was a British patrol on the other side of Basra was surrounded and massacred. About 6 British soldiers were killed. So basically, the implications of that squad on the other side of the city led to the deaths of troops on the other side. So detainees. Lieutenant Colonel Hughes in Najif, this was in the invasion of Iraq. He had a plan to go to one of the mosques in Najif to ask for a fatwa for permission to get the insurgents to stop fighting, to lay down their arms. This was taken completely wrong, and the people thought that the Americans were coming to take over the mosque and impose law or whatever. They took it wrong, a huge crowd formed, a massacre was actually averted. Hughes was actually famous for this in that he famously told his troops to stand down and literally take a knee and smile, and then had them back off, and he de-escalated the situation. But the point is, a situation like this could have gotten really bad really fast. So, force protection conclusion. A policy of complete cultural non-interaction leads to allowing Bacha Bazi being placed in such a category as to not intervene in a positive or negative light. Just don't touch them. Same thing with women, with mosques, with Ramadan. Just don't touch the issue. Just let it be, because even if you do something positive for it, it might be construed in a negative light afterward, and it will ruin the relations that we have with Afghans and with the local population. So, this goes in, the next topic I want to talk about is Afghan-American tension. Essentially, because our mission there was to bring stability, and the end goal was to make the Afghans self-sufficient on their own, to be able to fight the Taliban, to bring their own peace and stability. So our goal is to mentor, advise, work with, and support the Afghans. The end goal being that we would leave, and they could do it all on their own. However, the Afghans knew that if they didn't have us, if they didn't have our support, if they didn't have our air support, if they didn't have fuel, if they didn't have water, if they didn't have ammunition, they wouldn't be able to do the job that they were supposed to do, to be self-sufficient. So there's this Afghan pull and American push in that we're pushing them to be self-sufficient. We're pushing them to be on their own, to work on their own. Then there's the Afghan pull of pulling us in, of saying, no, we need you here, we need you longer, because we don't either trust ourselves enough, or we don't trust the political situation or the government situation or the security situation enough that we can do this on our own. Rightfully so in many cases, influenced by other things such as there's corrupt officials to deal with, there were local mullahs to deal with, there was local practices to deal with that they just couldn't get over, and they are having trouble with this. And we're seeing that today in the takeover of Kunduz, and this morning Lashkar Gaz and threat and stuff like that. But so anyways, this relationship it existed on a shoestring. There were times when we would literally be begging the AUP, hey, please, just go on patrol. We'll give you the water you need. And one of their conditions was, hey, we need water. They could get their own water, but they needed us as that support. We provided them fuel. We provided them with water. Another bit after that is, for example, doing Ramadan. They wanted to stay back. They didn't want to work at that time. But anyways, the relationship between, at the platoon level, at the patrol base level, with my platoon and with the Afghans themselves, it was just extremely tense. It was almost like button heads all the time. It was a constant argument over what was going on, what we would do, what we were there for, because we were trying to push them to be self-sufficient, and they were trying to pull us back from being self-sufficient. Thus, if you introduced something like Bacha Bazi in there, and I'll go into more exactly how it was going down at our patrol bases, if you were to introduce on top of, hey, you need to patrol, you need to go on your own, we need to do this, we need to be self-sufficient. Oh, and by the way, we don't want to work with your commanders, or your commanders have to be fired, or whatever, because of this Bacha Bazi thing. The entire relationship would probably be jeopardized because of that. Because you're already dealing with such a tight, such a tense situation as it is. And you can see the after effects of some of these tense situations in green on blue attacks, in Afghans shooting us or because we've offended them some way or another. And you can see that just a lot of this just boils out in that. So thus, if you were to introduce a measure against Bacha Bazi in there, the success that we did have at Loy Calais would have been almost muted because of that. In addition to, if we were to do something about the commanders, ostracizing them from the AUP, chances of them just joining the Taliban would increase even more. And this is something where it really gets into the fact of the matter. Becoming culturally tricked. Western notions of homosexuality do not transfer well to Afghan culture. Reason being, in the West, our notions of homosexuality or heterosexuality, if we see a younger man, maybe in his late teens, and we see an older man together and they're homosexual and they're doing their thing, very well. Maybe they might be below the age of consent, but if it's consensual, and maybe if they're over 18 or whatever, they've got their thing going on. It's okay. This goes into one of the misconceptions of Bacha Bazi, and that in the New York Times article, the New York Times talked about Bacha Bazi, and they mentioned some cases, they mentioned the really extreme cases of it, of children being chained to beds, being locked to beds, and not being able to move, being sexually assaulted, being raped, all that stuff, of 12, 13, 11-year-olds, of horrible things happening like that. There's a story that I know of where a child was brought to one of our patrol bases, and one of our medics or corpsmen had to stitch him up because he was raped so horribly that his anus teared. It was disgusting. And the kid was like 11 years old. This exists, and it's horrible, and it's absolutely disgusting, however way you look at it. Afghans think it's disgusting, Americans think it's disgusting. However, this is only in about 10% of the cases of Bacha Bazi happening on our patrol bases. Where we get tricked in this, and these are all pictures from my patrol base. All these guys, all the guys who are blacked out, those are all the Bachas on my patrol base. Before this talk started, we knew of Bacha Bazi happening. We knew of at least two of them. I knew of at least two of them. But as I put this talk together, I started going through a bunch of my pictures, and I started realizing that we probably had almost 6 Bachas on our patrol base over the course of a single deployment. Not just 2, but 6. Reason being, well, because this is how we got tricked, in that we'd see guys like this, guys like that, and we knew they were sleeping with the commanders. We asked our interpreters about it. Our interpreters told us, yeah, our room is opposite of the commander's room. We hear them having sex like every night or whatever, and we're just like, okay. They look to be somewhat of age. They're old enough. They're not chained to a bed. It doesn't look like they're forced or anything. It doesn't look like they're being coerced into anything. They look fine. What's the big deal? It's a younger guy having sex with the older commanders. And these are the 2 commanders, by the way. You can actually see those are their 2 Bachas. This is a group picture that we had with them. This commander was killed in an IED later on. But that's his Bacha, that's his Bacha. And this is where we went wrong, because we were kind of tricked into thinking that something like this was okay. Whereas, like, why should we ask any more questions? It's a younger guy serving as a chai boy, or a chai means tea in Pashto or Farsi, and serving as a chai boy as a servant to an older guy. Maybe he's getting paid or whatever, but it wasn't. If we were to look further into it, and if we knew what actually was going on, these kids, these later age teenagers, were the way kids get into Bacha Bazi is similar how youths in the States kind of get into gang violence. It's a way out. It's a way for them to make a living, because the job situation in Afghanistan isn't good, hasn't been good for the past 30 years. If you're a young kid and you're somewhat good looking and you have fair skin, going into something like this isn't a bad idea compared to starving to death. So that's why some of these kids ended up being coerced into it. An interesting fact about Bacha Bazi is that a lot of these kids weren't from the same clan, tribe, or family as the men doing it. as the commanders who had them. The reason being, Bacha Bazi won't happen with the same family, tribe, or clan as the person who is exerting power as an authority figure over the Bachas. They won't do it to their own people, they'll do it to somebody else's people. Sometimes it'll be as a form of revenge, as saying, as a part of Pashtun Wali, as a tribal code of saying, I'm going to get Bache from your tribe, and he's going to be mine, I'm going to do that. They go up until about the age of 21, and then they're kind of released as, okay, now you're a man now, you can't be a Bache anymore, I'll go get another one, or so on. And as in the case of this deployment, there were 6 of them between the 2 commanders, and they always existed. The disturbing thing about it is that what the commanders would do, like you can see right here, this is one of the actual AUP guys. These are the guys who aren't blacked out, the Afghans who aren't blacked out, those are actual AUP patrolmen. They're actual Afghan policemen. Who would go on patrols with us, they'd go out with us, they'd go to checkpoints, they'd do their thing with us, and we'd see that. And they put a lot of effort in. Some were good, some were bad. But he can't even take the Bache seriously. None of them could take them seriously. But this goes into the disturbing thing, is that the commanders would put them in AUP uniforms, give them firearms in some cases, and they would actually go out with us on a patrol or 2 sometimes. That's disturbing because they're not AUP, they're not policemen. They never did any of the training. They're never supposed to be that. It's almost like the commanders told them to say, hey, what are you doing today? Oh, you're not doing anything? We'll go out on this patrol. Here's an AK, take it. And that's some of the other things you can see about them. And they were complete outliers in there, and that's how we were kind of alarmed to them and warned them, that kind of thing. So, with that being said, you could say that we were culturally tricked into thinking that they weren't actually, there wasn't anything wrong going on. This kid over here, this is the Afghan local police, the ALP, different organization from the AUP. I don't know if he was a Bacha or not, but he was about 12 years old, and he was walking around them. If he was, I don't know. They came to our base one day, and I saw him, and I took that picture of him. But that's just an example as well, as, you know, just 12-year-olds carrying around AKs with them there. Child soldiers, child labor, whatever you want to go through. This commander, both commanders had families. This commander would bring his son to the base sometimes and would just say, hey, you Marines want to hang out with my son? And I looked over him for a couple hours one time, watched a movie with him. He had a whole family, and that's a common case with Bacha Bazi as well. It's that the commanders will have families as well, and then they were away from their wives. They didn't live with their wives. Their wives were in Lashkar-Gah or another city, and they would use the Bachas for their sexual pleasure and so on and so forth at the bases while they were away. So the cultural conclusion here is the cultural values of Marines didn't allow for the full extent of the problem to be realized, despite the fact that it was happening among our bases, on our patrol bases, on our combat outposts, on our forward operating bases, and etc. So, thinking lofty policy, I can't get into that. But this is kind of the conclusion of if we want to do anything or change anything about Bacha Bazi. Well, one, first of all, is it even within the American ISAF right to change anything about it in the first place? Well, are we being imperialist in that? And that conversation and debate can go on forever. But the current policy is hindered by all the previous points I listed out. The current military policy falls into the policies of the cultural interaction of the force protection measures that I listed earlier. The official policy is we're not going to do anything for it, and we're not going to do anything against it. We respect the sovereignty, that it's illegal, and so on and so forth. But then we have this going on at our own bases, and we're somewhat allowing it. We're completely allowing it to happen. Despite being taboo, the practice is deeply rooted in Afghan society, both civilian and Afghan national security forces. So it's not just Afghan police, Afghan army problem. The defense minister, as you saw earlier, was in a Bacha Bazi party taking place. It's an Afghan society thing that can't just come from the military side of it as well. And then the only military solution has to come from the top to the lower levels. If, just as I listed earlier, with that tension going on between the Afghan police and between us at our patrol base at Lloyd Lake, with that tension going on, there's no way that we could have done anything about Bacha Bazi, about the Bachas that were owned by the commanders in there. There's no way we could have done anything at all without extremely jeopardizing, extremely screwing up the mission that we had and the successful relationship that we had. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
If you know, are there any differences in the attitude toward this practice among ethnic groups or regions in Afghanistan, or is it Afghan-wide, regardless of ethnicity or region?
Yeah, there are, and this goes more into the civilian route of what Bacha Bazi is. In the north, but the Bachas are mostly used for dancing, that sort of thing. In Kunar province, and Korengal, the Bachas are sometimes used as a revenge thing that I was talking about earlier. And actually, some of the dancing masters or the powerful figures in Kunar, in Korengal, will mention the people in Kandahar and say, well, you know, you guys actually do it because you like it. We only do it because we want revenge on whoever it is. It's besides the sexual point of that matter. Yeah.
So, with this practice taking place, did that have much of an effect upon the view of civilians towards the U.S. Armed Forces, or did it not really have much of a
that civilians would look at us and say, "Oh, look at them! They're supporting it.
Yeah.
Or they're condoning it somehow."
Right.
It's so deeply rooted in society that I think it would be. Civilians never brought it up to us.
Okay.
On us, but seeing that it's practiced all over. The Taliban, one of the famous legends about the Taliban was that they came to power when they took a Bacha Bazi master guy, whatever, and they took him and they hung him and they said, hey, we're not going to stand for Bacha Bazi, whatever. And that was one of the things when they came to power in 1992, 1991. Along with they executed, like there was a local warlord in Kandahar who had captured 30 girls, he kidnapped them, and the Taliban sought him out, hung him from a tank, and rescued the girls. And that was one of the moral strong points of the Taliban. Say, hey, we're bringing this, we're getting rid of Bacha Bazi, we stand for the moral right, blah, blah, blah. However, during the actual Taliban reign of power, the Taliban were doing it just as much as everybody else. They were saying Taliban warlords were just as culpable as the other warlords who were doing it as well. By law, the Taliban banned it and said, you're not going to do this practice. During that time, the dancing parties went down a little bit because of the music, because the Taliban were against music and against that kind of thing. However, they would use people caught by Bacha Bazi. They would say, okay, we're going to hang this guy because he participated in Bacha Bazi. Sure, that would be the icing on the cake. That would be the outside salute. That would be what it would look like on the outside. But in fact, there was more going on. That guy maybe had something to do with this Taliban commander not liking that guy, or he had a family feud going on. He just didn't talk about that, but they just hung him for Bacha Bazi. Bacha Bazi was just as prevalent during the Taliban as it was before and as it was after. Yeah.
Why wouldn't we treat it like we treated a cultural thing in any society? Why wouldn't we say, make sure the person was at least 16, because in America, I guess 16 is usually the age of consent.
Consent, yeah.
And then put posters up in multiple languages saying, if you feel coerced, if you feel, kind of things we do on campuses, other things, but of course in the other language. And then be very specific about no civilians who don't have the training getting weapons. I mean, you take the steps you can take without saying you can't have a relationship with someone. Just put all the things together to make sure it's as consensual as possible, as far as the person having options to come and and say, this isn't right. I'm getting coerced. My family's threatened. Something like, what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
There's steps we could have taken.
Coulda, shoulda, woulda. I'll go back to answer that with, this goes back to the cultural thing with the force protection measures with women. you can't do anything positive about it, you can't do anything negative about it, because either way, it's going to be construed as we're the occupying force and we're doing something bad against Afghan women. If we did that, well, then again, before that, that would have been a more Afghan government policy to do. That would have been in their realm more than an ISAF, a security concern going on. But that goes back to, again, with the women, with the mosques, with Ramadan, with...
But none of those are culturally not just looked down upon, but scorned, despised. You know, I mean, it sounds like they didn't bring children onto the bases.
They did.
They brought children on for this purpose.
Yeah. Though all those guys I showed you earlier.
Oh, then, I mean, children for that purpose. Then, yeah, we could step in, and it's scorned by the society, so it wouldn't have the same. That, I mean, it could be praised outside of the bases rather than, you know, we're imposing our cultural thing on them. If a lot of them don't believe, if the vast majority of them don't believe it.
To answer that.
Miles, if I could, you know, I think there's a case that just in the news, you might have seen the Special Forces soldier who intervened and attacked one of the officers, you know, to get him away from the child he had, and he was thrown out of the service.
Yeah.
You know, there's a controversial case right now where he did intervene in Afghanistan on this practice.
It has to go top down, I guess.
Right, and I think the command policy, I heard General Campbell in his testimony, was what we do is observe and report what we consider human rights violations. And I don't know if that was the policy driven down as low to you, but did you all, was this part of the trickery? You didn't consider it necessarily human rights?
That's where...
I mean, is this part of the issue?
That's where the trickery comes in. We didn't know there was an issue to begin with, you know? Like if we had known that, you know, the kids that were on our bases, they were being coerced into it, they didn't want to be there to begin with, they were just doing it
kids,
way out.
just kids having sex with kids, and period, is, at least in our values, is considered coercive.
Mhm.
So, and
Right.
molestation.
They can't consent, right?
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. But we didn't see it. Like, we didn't, all the kids I showed you earlier, all the teenagers, they weren't being chained to beds, they weren't screaming, they weren't coming to our corpsmen, they weren't asking for help, they weren't going out of their way. It didn't look like anything was wrong. It was, oh.
So some of them looked under 16?
We can go back to it.
Because that's where, you know, that's where I'm just, there's standards, you know, we can uphold, and if the Afghan society agrees with them, absolutely go and uphold them.
But in the military, I mean, that was what one of the constraints. You weren't allowed to interfere. Once we sort of, in Iraq, let me say, when we returned sovereignty to the Iraqi government, then we sort of became observers. You know, we participated in security operations, but we're not allowed to interfere. Even when we saw torture and things of this nature, it was observed.
American base, though, we're talking about an American base, right?
Well, we're talking about, this is on an American base, but we're talking anything that we ran into, it was observe and report
Right.
as a human rights violation. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Also-
a top-down thing. On the base is where, even if it's going to happen outside of the base, on the base is where we could have put that foot down and made a stand from the top down.
That would have had to happen there. It could not have happened at my level, at the platoon level, at that lower level right there. Which goes back to how we ran counterinsurgency operations, which everything is partnered. So, yeah, it's our base, and yeah, we fund them, and yeah, we bankroll them, and payroll them, and supply them, and everything. But we're still trying to push them to be self-sufficient. So, we have to let them do their thing, which goes back to the, if they do whatever, let them do that kind of deal. Go ahead.
Were you ever briefed on this practice before you went over there by the military?
I didn't know it existed until I got back. We knew about the kids. We knew that the kids were having sex with the commanders. We knew that our interpreters told us, said, hey, our room is right opposite from the commanders room, we can hear them every night. But we thought nothing of it, because, well, they seemed fine, kind of thing. Yeah.
So I have a two-part question. First question is, are we putting mirror at him? I'm sorry.
You, Alice.
Well, the first question is, were there any instances of U.S. military personnel ever participating in Bacha Bazi?
Participating in it.
And
No.
two, is there ever, like, is Afghanistan involved the hotspot for international child sex tourism?
Bacha Bazi goes throughout Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Yes, Afghanistan is a hotspot for human trafficking. For not just Bacha Bazi, but also for prostitution, also for sex slavery and that kind of thing. Yes, yeah, it does happen. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that there were 12-year-olds with Kalashnikovs on patrol with American forces.
These were more like 16, 17-year-olds.
But I guess my question is, lacking any real training, did any of the American commanders ever point out that this is a potential huge liability and could jeopardize the lives of U.S. soldiers having somebody who is untrained and having an assault rifle with them?
No, that was never pointed out.
But it was known about, though.
We knew about it.
Yeah.
We knew. I knew. This guy right here, he would always go on patrol with us. Well, not always, but he went on about two with me for sure, and I knew for a fact. And because the thing is, like these AUP, like this guy in particular, like this guy's name, we nicknamed him Rambo. A couple other guys, they were great guys. Like we loved them. They would go out with us. Some of them weren't great guys, to be honest. But like these two guys in particular, they would go out with us. They'd take point. They'd carry machine guns. They'd go out. They'd want to get into fights. They'd want to go over on that kind of thing. They'd want to. And then like this guy would come out on patrol, whatever, and we'd be kind of puzzled. Why is he here? Why he's usually wearing civilian attire back at the base, hanging out with the commander in the commander's room. Why is he out here? Well, was I kind of fearful that this guy's out with us, not doing anything? No, this guy's out with us and he's completely untrained and he's not an Afghan policeman to begin with and he's just a boy on the base and he's out with us with an automatic weapon with 3 magazines. Somewhat. But the area, the Nawa district that we were in, on the 2011 deployment, it wasn't very kinetic at all. We didn't see much action with the Taliban. It was mostly improvised explosive devices or IEDs. If it had been more kinetic, I think we would have been more worried, seeing that they don't know what to do.
What types of implications do you think your experiences might have for future military or humanitarian collaborations between America and other populations? For instance, the collaborations that kind of went to seed in Syria.
I think we should know a little bit more about what we're getting into before we get into it. If I had known about Bacha Bazi before I went there, I would have been more alerted to it. If I had known that, these kids are coerced, they're doing it as a way to get out. The commanders themselves were probably a Bacha themselves when they were younger, and it's kind of like a repeat offender or pedophiles in the States. Like they were molested when they were younger, so they're going to do the same thing when they get older. That was probably the case with these two guys right there. I would have liked to know about it beforehand. That just goes into just cultural knowledge that oftentimes we never get. We got cultural knowledge and cultural briefs and that kind of thing, but Bacha Bazi was never on any of that whatsoever.
Why do you think they never mentioned that to you?
Never mentioned Bacha Bazi.
Yeah.
I think because they have to dumb it down to servicemen. They have to say, okay, what's the easiest way we can get this across that will get the most basic points and that will be relevant to what they're going to go through. And this Bacha Bazi isn't relevant compared to understanding not to touch women at all. Such as, for instance, women, mosques, Ramadan, detainees, those are humongous beforehand. I knew before I even stepped foot in Afghanistan, don't look at women whatsoever. I remember one patrol, we were driving back and I was the turret gunner, and there was a group of women in burqas walking on the other side of the road, and one of them had their burqa face mask lifted up, and she looked up at me from the other side of the road and she smiled, and I was in shock. It was the first time I'd ever seen an Afghan woman's face, ever, because they were like that, because you just don't touch them, don't deal with them. Another example of that is a lot of the cars in Helmand are either white Toyota Corollas, sedans, or white pickup trucks. They're everywhere, all over the place. and we can't touch women to begin with, so we got an advising report, you could say, that went, there's a suicide bomber dressed in a burqa in a white Toyota Corolla driving around. Be aware of that. And we're like, oh, that's great. One, every single car around here is a white Toyota Corolla. Two, it's someone in a burqa, so even if we stopped the car right in front of us, we couldn't ask her to get out and, hey, could you lift up your burqa, please? Like, we need to see under it for security reasons. We can't do that to begin with. As another example, like when on the second deployment, when we'd be searching houses, and I would be the first one in, the first thing I would do is I would get the male form of the male man of the house, the male leader, the family leader, whatever, and I would get him and I would say, hey, take all your women, put them in that room over there. We're going to search all these houses, then you're going to take your women and put them in that room, and then we're going to search that room. We don't want your women, we don't want anything to do with that. We want to see if you have bombs, if you have guns, if you have pistols, if you have HME, if you have drugs, opium, hashish, whatsoever. So.
Well, how would you know if the women were hiding them under their burqas?
You did.
An example of that, on the second deployment, there was an Afghan Special Forces guy who worked with us, and he noticed a burqa-clad woman walking around, and he told them, he said, hey, search her. Like, and they was like, search her? Like, what do you mean? Like, we can't touch them. He's like, no, do it. They brought the woman over, pulled up the burqa, and it was one of the Taliban, it was one of the key leaders, one of the Taliban key leaders. They're like, how did you know that was a guy underneath it? And then he said, easy, she was wearing sneakers.
So the woman was a guy. She was,
yes.
I was trying to figure out
Yeah.
how it must be a pretty big burqa for the guy. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the burqas in Afghanistan are completely full length. They have it's not like in Saudi where they have an eye slit where you can see the eyes. No, it's like a braided material that goes in front of here, and it's got little crisscrosses on it, so they can look out, but you can't see past that at all.
So without sneakers, as long as the burqas are enough to keep the feet hidden, essentially they can go anywhere. Right. Taliban can go anywhere. Not Taliban, I mean just, anyone fighting the U.S. forces can go wherever they want.
In a burqa. Yeah, and they did that multiple times. And we couldn't do anything about it because of, this goes back to, we can't have anything to do with women. Nothing. Don't touch them, don't look at them, don't even make it suggestive that something might have happened with that you had an interaction with the woman. So it goes back to that, we can't do anything about it.
Many times they would put weapons in coffins at funerals and move weapons around, and you can't, of course, go into a funeral and raid a funeral, and open the coffin. So
that goes into the cultural force protection things. If it's cultural, you can't touch it because of the sensitivity that it would raise.
Any other questions?
Over
Sorry,
here.
there's our
I'm taking
wonderful
over now.
assistant director. Yeah.
Thank you, Ruth.
Oh,
Well,
he's got a question. He's got a question.
Yeah.
Question.
I was going to ask, there's an article recently since this went about the specific scripts that you're given in your training before you go over, and some of them cover the issue of sexual assault, and I'd just like to know a little bit more about what those scripts look like. From my understanding is that mostly it covers what you as a soldier should not be doing, and does not talk too much about what the Afghan or anybody over there is doing.
Like sexual assault is in, like, we see sexual assault happening,
Yeah,
what should we do?
Basically the general question is what do the scripts look like that you were...
I didn't see these scripts.
Okay, well, I mean, then the follow-up question would be, now, are you expecting that the story is so big for more soldiers to come forward, or do you think that people will adhere to the policy?
I mean, I think guys should come forward with stuff like that I'm talking about, like I'm doing right now. I think guys should come out and talk about it, because stuff like the New York Times article makes it out to be that these were 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, chained to beds, being horribly sexually assaulted every day. They could hear their cries and screams, da-da-da-da, which is true. That happened. That absolutely happened on some bases. But for the majority, it wasn't. It was this cultural trickery thing going on, that this horrible human rights practice was going on right under our noses, and we didn't know a thing about it. We didn't realize it was happening.
Do you think it'll be incorporated into the training in the future?
It could be, but this Bacha Bazi is very Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, very those countries related. So unless anything, so you can't, Bacha Bazi doesn't exist in Syria. Other things exist in Syria, but not Bacha Bazi. So what's the use of understanding Bacha Bazi if you're going into Syria? You know, so unless, maybe it should be incorporated into troops going into Afghanistan. That's absolutely true. But other than that, yeah.
It seems to me that it goes into how it's viewed. If it's viewed as a form of homosexuality, it will not be incorporated into telling soldiers to watch for it because of, you know, how those things are seen in our society. If it's a form of pedophilia, you know, then maybe there will be something about it. But it's still, if you, in the beginning I said General Campbell was testifying at the Senate Armed Services Committee, and they asked him this particular question, and he said, well, it's our policy to observe and report. I mean, it's higher even than our, you know, commanding generals. It's a national, you know, it's a presidential level policy here.
So I have one more question.
Yeah.
I think I completely understand that it is a cultural issue, and there's like a lot of literature on that, I'm sure. But I think how much there are articles recently released who often say that there's a power vacuum, and in power vacuums you often have situations of sexual assault.
Mm-hmm.
This has been the case with a lot of peacekeeping forces in places like Bosnia.
Well, the French in not Libya, but the Cameroons, I think, had a huge problem with the French UN forces being perpetrators of sexual assault. The actual peacekeepers themselves.
I mean, so it's easy to say something like there's an anti-cultural issue, but
Yeah.
there are root causes that come from other places as well.
So wait, what's the question?
The question is, do you think that there's like a sense of lawlessness that people feel that allows something like this to happen?
Yes and no, because Bacha Bazi has been happening in Afghanistan, whether or not there was lawlessness to begin with or not. It's been a fact of Afghan culture for a long time. It's been a fact of Central Eurasian culture for an even longer time, for thousands of years. But whether or not there is law or lawlessness in Afghanistan is besides the point, because it's still going to take place either way. If you watch the CBS documentary, or the Dancing Boys of Afghanistan, it talks about them, and there's not that much lawlessness there. It was filmed in 2002 or filmed in 2005, and the country was still pretty much together by that time. It hadn't blown up like in 2008, 7, 6, 10 and 9 as well. So, yes?
I just want to add on this because I'm from Afghanistan and I've been there for a long time. Recently there has been activism like against Bacha Bazi, and we have got big